So thank you, Chris and Cynthia, for holding this event. Thank you, Joel and Dan, for co-sponsoring this event, and for supporting my past research on violence prevention. Much appreciated. Your work on this space is so important. I'll be talking today about community violence interventions. We've been hearing about some of these so far today from some of the morning speakers. I also want to thank the speakers who have talked so far. Really nice to travel back here to Washington, D.C., where I lived for 20 years, and just see the level of expertise that you all have been able to mobilize. I learned a lot just already today listening to the morning speakers, so thank you all. I'll be talking about community violence interventions, and so I want to start by just talking about that term community violence. And so violence, as some of the speakers today have already alluded to, is not one thing. Right? We often tend to think about violence and even gun violence as one thing, but it's many different kinds of problems sort of all globbed together. And in order to really understand these types of violence, it's important to disaggregate them. And so when we talk about community violence, we're leaving out things like intimate partner violence in the home and mass shootings and spree shootings and these types of things. And we're typically talking about the much more common types of violence that occurs often in impoverished communities, often involving the resolution of disputes by people who lack another mechanism for resolving these types of disputes, whether these are gang-related or drug-related or otherwise sort of offender-related types of disputes. And that end up being solved with gun violence. And it's that type of violence that I'm talking about when I refer to community violence. Community violence interventions have really emerged and are now becoming very popular over the past 10 or 15 years. And I'll be talking about one particular type of community violence intervention, which my team and I refer to as street outreach conflict mediation strategies. And these are strategies where people who are not part of the criminal justice system or not government, or at least criminal justice officials, are actively involved in communities seeking to mediate disputes, seeking to resolve conflicts, and seeking to prevent shootings, many of which are impending acts of retaliation. And because they're impending acts of retaliation, they're somewhat predictable to some extent. You shoot my friend, now I shoot you, and we see this pattern of tit-for-tat shootings, and it's possible to intervene early on in those types of retaliatory cycles and to possibly prevent many shootings and many deaths. And so community violence intervention strategies, particularly these street outreach conflict mediation strategies that I'm talking about, can potentially have a powerful effect on those types of shootings. Problem is that the research evidence on these things is mixed. If you were to go and read every study that's been done on the effectiveness of these strategies for reducing violence, and I asked you to report back to me afterwards what you learned, you would come up to me puzzled and confused and just genuinely uncertain about whether these things work. Why? Because some studies find that they don't work. Some studies find that they do work. And some studies find that they're counterproductive and may actually increase violence. So what are we supposed to do with a pattern of research evidence that's so messy? And this is where systematic reviews come in. And so my research team and I decided to do a Campbell collaboration systematic review. This is just a very structured way of reviewing the research evidence on a particular topic, and to go out and gather the findings from every study that we could find, whether published or unpublished, and follow the very strict protocol of the Campbell collaboration in trying to determine whether these types of strategies work. Let's take a minute and think about some of these studies that have happened so far. The very first major study was an evaluation of a program called Chicago Ceasefire, which later became renamed Cure Violence. Not the only street outreach conflict mediation strategy, but certainly the most well-known. And that strategy or that evaluation is often used as evidence by advocates of these strategies to say that they work, that they have a dramatic effect on reducing violence. But actually, if you look closely at the research, even that study, which did show some success, the findings were really uneven across the 7 neighborhoods and across the 3 offense types that they looked at. So even in one of the earliest studies that was used to sort of as evidence that these things work really well, the findings were very mixed. My team and I led our own evaluation in Trinidad and Tobago, a small Caribbean country just off the coast of Venezuela. And that study actually demonstrated some of the most powerful effects in the literature so far. We found dramatic reductions in shootings and homicides in Trinidad. And what was interesting about the study was, because we often hear that implementation failure is the reason for the inconsistent results, this project defined implementation failure. There was implementation failure all over the map, but the very heroic types of people that Joseph Richardson and others were talking about this morning, in spite of that implementation failure at the administrative level, we're still out there on the streets in the middle of the night doing the very dangerous, very compelling work of stopping people from shooting other people. And that, in the end, I think is what contributed, at least in that study, to the dramatic success in reducing violence. So we reviewed the literature using the Campbell Systematic Review Protocol. We identified 26 studies that met our criteria. 21 of those contained sufficient estimates for our initial phase of our meta-analysis. The term meta-analysis is just simply a quantitative synthesis of the literature. And so our first phase is just based on those 21 studies. We are going back to contact in phase 2 all of the authors who produced evidence where we couldn't extract from their studies the quantities necessary to include in our meta-analysis. So there will be a phase 2, and the results may vary depending on what we collect in that next phase. What I'm presenting to you so far is phase 1, where taking at face value all of the evidence that's reported in the studies that we were able to use. And what do we find? We found a small but significant reduction in overall violence. When we disaggregate that into fatal and non-fatal shootings, we didn't find any effect on homicides. I won't bore you with the statistical reasons or why we might have found such an effect, just to say that at the neighborhood level, homicides are much rarer than non-fatal shootings, and it's much more difficult in terms of statistical power to detect such an effect. So we're still in progress on that particular finding. We'll do more analysis on that later. But the powerful finding here was we found a statistically significant effect in terms of non-fatal shootings. So these programs were associated with significant reductions in non-fatal shootings. And so taking this messy body of research evidence and trying to sort of consolidate it together into a meta-analysis, we did find statistically significant reductions in violence associated with these initiatives. So these are preliminary results. We're still ongoing with the next phase of the study. But one of the things that I think we really want to focus on in that next phase is trying to figure out, why do some of them work, some of them don't work, and some of them make things worse? This is a real puzzle. We need to solve this puzzle. And so researchers refer to that type of analysis as a moderator analysis. In other words, what are these factors out there that influence why a program might work in some cases, not work in others, and have what we call an iatrogenic effect, just a fancy term for they make things worse. And so that's the next phase of the study, is really trying to isolate those types of issues. Folks, thank you very much for your attention today. Much appreciated.